Imagine your family vanishing without a trace, swallowed by the impenetrable depths of the Amazon jungle. 9 agonizing weeks crawl by, hope dwindling with each passing day. But just when all seems lost, a desperate search unearths a cryptic clue, a set of coordinates carved into an ancient tree. What secrets do they hide? As the search intensifies, a shocking discovery shatters everything you thought you knew, revealing a sinister truth lurking beneath the jungle's beauty. Prepare to be gripped by a tale of suspense, betrayal, and the unwavering power of a father's love. To uncover the full truth and witness the heart-stopping climax, watch this video until the very end. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more thrilling stories. The late afternoon sun cast long golden fingers across the Lamar Valley, painting the swaying grasslands of Yellowstone in hues of amber and ochre. A gentle breeze, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, whispered through the open windows of the rented SUV as David steered along the winding road. Inside, a comfortable silence reigned, the kind that settles between people who share a deep affection and a familiarity born of years. Emily, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, gazed out at the grazing bison, her expression serene. A geologist by profession, she found a profound peace in the raw, untamed beauty of the park, a stark contrast to the sterile order of her lab. Beside her, 8-year-old Oliver pressed his face against the glass, his eyes wide with a childlike wonder. "Dad, look, a whole herd!" His voice, still carrying the high pitch of boyhood, was filled with excitement. David smiled, his gaze flicking between the road and his son. "Good eyes, buddy. They're magnificent, aren't they?" He shared Emily's love for this place, the sense of stepping back into a primordial world where nature reigned supreme. It was a world away from their tidy suburban life, the schedules and routines that usually dictated their days. Here, time seemed to slow, measured by the rising and setting of the sun, the movements of the wildlife. They had arrived at Yellowstone 3 days prior, seeking respite from the pressures of work and the relentless pace of modern life. Their days were filled with leisurely hikes, geyser gazing, and wildlife spotting, simple pleasures that strengthened the bonds between them. David watched Emily as she pointed out a distant coyote to Oliver, her face animated, her laughter light and free. A pang of tenderness resonated within him. These were the moments he cherished, the moments that made all the stresses worthwhile. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, they decided to stop at a small pullout overlooking the Yellowstone River. The air was cooler here, carrying the promise of twilight. David spread a blanket on the grassy bank while Emily unpacked a picnic basket filled with sandwiches and fruit. Oliver, ever the explorer, scampered off towards the riverbank, his small frame a blur of energy against the vast landscape. "Don't go too close to the edge, Ollie," Emily called out, her voice laced with a mother's gentle concern. "I won't, Mom," he shouted back, his attention already captivated by something on the ground. David watched him, a familiar sense of pride swelling in his chest. Oliver possessed an insatiable curiosity, a thirst for discovery that reminded him of Emily's own passion for the natural world. It was this shared trait that often drew them together, mother and son united in their fascination with the Earth's hidden wonders. A few minutes later, Oliver came running back, his hands cupped tightly together. "Look what I found," he exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement. Emily and David exchanged amused glances as he knelt before them, carefully opening his hands. Nestled in his palm was a stone, unlike any they had seen before. It was small, no bigger than a robin's egg, and perfectly smooth, as if polished by some unseen hand. But it was the stone's color that was truly remarkable. It shimmered with an iridescent glow, shifting between hues of deep blue, emerald green, and a fiery orange as Oliver turned it in his hand. Emily, the geologist, leaned closer, her eyebrows furrowed in curiosity. She gently took the stone from Oliver's outstretched hand, examining it with a practiced eye. "That's extraordinary," she murmured, her voice filled with a mixture of wonder and bewilderment. "I've never seen anything quite like it." David, though less versed in geology, could sense the unusual nature of the find. There was an otherworldly quality to the stone, a sense that it didn't quite belong in this rugged, earthy landscape. A prickle of unease ran down his spine, a subtle dissonance in the otherwise perfect harmony of the moment. He couldn't shake the feeling that this seemingly innocent discovery was somehow significant. The twilight deepened, casting long shadows that danced and stretched across the valley floor. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of wood smoke from a distant campfire. David, content in the quiet companionship, watched as Emily and Oliver strolled along a narrow trail that branched off from the riverbank. Oliver clutched the iridescent stone in his hand, turning it over and over, his head bent in fascination. "Don't wander too far," David called out, his voice warm with affection. "Dinner's almost ready." Emily turned and smiled, her expression radiant in the fading light. "Just a little further, love. Oliver wants to see where this path leads." She gestured towards a cluster of trees that stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, their branches reaching up like gnarled fingers. David nodded, his gaze lingering on them for a moment longer. There was something about the way the light was fading, the encroaching shadows that stirred a faint unease within him. He couldn't quite place it, but it was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a whisper of something unseen. He turned back to the blanket, arranging the sandwiches and fruit, the mundane task grounding him. He told himself it was just the wilderness, the inherent wildness of the place that made him feel this way. Yellowstone had that effect, a constant reminder of the raw power of nature. He waited, the minutes ticking by with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sky deepened into a rich indigo, the stars beginning to prick holes in the canvas of night. The distant coyote's howl, which had been a comforting part of the soundscape, now seemed to carry a lonely, mournful tone. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in David's chest. They had been gone longer than he expected. "Emily! Oliver!" he called out, his voice louder this time, the edge of his concern cutting through the stillness. Only silence answered. He stood up, his gaze scanning the trail where they had disappeared. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows obscuring any sign of movement. "Emily?" he called again, his voice sharper now, the first tendrils of fear beginning to snake their way into his heart. He started down the trail, his boots crunching on the gravel, the sound amplified in the growing silence. Ollie?" His voice cracked slightly, the forced calmness giving way to a tremor of panic. The trail twisted and turned through the trees, the darkness thickening with each step. He quickened his pace, breaking into a jog, his breath catching in his throat. The playful banter of a few minutes ago was replaced by a desperate urgency, a primal fear that clawed at his insides. He reached the cluster of trees Emily had gestured towards, his eyes straining in the gloom. The trail seemed to vanish into the dense undergrowth, the darkness swallowing it whole. "Emily!" he roared, his voice raw with terror. "Oliver!" His calls echoed through the trees, bouncing back at him, mocking his desperation. There was no response, only the rustling of leaves in the wind, the whisper of the river in the distance. David stumbled back, his legs suddenly heavy, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He felt a cold sweat break out on his skin, his hands trembling uncontrollably. This wasn't right. They wouldn't just disappear. Not Emily, not Oliver. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. No signal, of course. They were miles from civilization, swallowed by the vast wilderness. He cursed under his breath, the futility of his situation hitting him like a physical blow. He ran back to the blanket, grabbing his flashlight, its beam cutting a meager swathe through the oppressive darkness. He scanned the area, his eyes darting frantically, searching for any sign, Any clue? The iridescent stone lay on the blanket, its strange glow muted in the absence of direct sunlight. It seemed to pulse faintly, a silent, enigmatic beacon. He picked it up, his fingers tightening around it as if it were a lifeline. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a sickening lurch in his stomach. He fought it back, forcing himself to focus. He had to think clearly. He had to find them. He started to run again, his flashlight beam sweeping through the trees, his calls growing more frantic, more desperate. The idyllic beauty of a few hours ago had transformed into a menacing wilderness, a place of shadows and secrets where his wife and son had simply vanished. The first tendrils of dawn pierced the inky blackness, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the landscape. David, his body aching with exhaustion and his mind still reeling from the events of the previous night, stood outside the small ranger station, the crisp morning air stinging his lungs. The events of the disappearance played on his mind. Sheriff Brody, a tall, weathered man with eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of 1,000 Yellowstone sunsets, stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the rugged terrain stretching out before them. A handful of search and rescue volunteers, clad in bright orange jackets, bustled around them, checking equipment and radios. "It's a vast area," Brody said, his voice gravelly like the stones underfoot. "Even with all these folks, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack." David nodded, his jaw tight. "I know the park. I used to be a ranger here, years back." He hadn't mentioned this to Brody before, unsure how it would be received. Brody turned, his gaze sharp. "A ranger? Well, that's useful. How long were you here?" 5 years, David replied. "I know the trails, the off-trail routes, the animal patterns, everything." He felt a flicker of something akin to hope ignite within him. Maybe, just maybe, his past experience could make a difference. A hint of respect flickered in Brody's eyes. "All right, we can use that. But you follow my lead. This is my search, my park." "Understood," David said, suppressing a surge of defiance. He wasn't here to challenge Brody's authority. He was here to find his family. The initial search was organized with methodical precision. Volunteers were divided into teams, each assigned a specific sector of the park. David was paired with a young, eager woman named Sarah, her enthusiasm a stark contrast to the grim determination etched on his face. As they set off, Brody handed David a map, its topographical lines a familiar language to him. "Start with the trails closest to where you last saw them," Brody instructed. "Then we'll widen the search." David nodded, his fingers tracing the route Emily and Oliver had taken. The trail wound its way through a dense forest of lodgepole pine, the air thick with the scent of resin and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. "They wouldn't have strayed far," David muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. Emily was always cautious. But even as he said the words, a seed of doubt was planted. The stone. That strange, iridescent stone. It had captivated Oliver. What if he had wandered off, drawn by its allure, and Emily had followed? They walked in silence for a long time, their eyes scanning the undergrowth, searching for any sign, any clue. David felt a growing sense of frustration, the silence of the forest mocking his desperate hope. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him, only to be followed by crushing disappointment. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows. They found nothing. No footprints, no discarded belongings, no sign that Emily and Oliver had ever been there. David's earlier hope began to dwindle, replaced by a gnawing despair. Was Brody right? Was it truly a futile effort? As they paused to rest by a small stream, Sarah broke the silence. "You okay, David? You look haunted." David managed a weak smile. "Just tired and scared." He hesitated for a moment, then decided to confide in her. "That stone Oliver found, it was strange. Emily had never seen anything like it." Sarah frowned. "Strange how?" David struggled to describe it. It shimmered, changed color. It was like it was alive. He knew it sounded irrational, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the stone held some significance. Sarah looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe we should show it to Brody, see if he recognizes it." David nodded slowly. It was worth a try. But deep down, he knew that the answer to his family's disappearance lay not in the ordinary, but in the unsettling mystery of the iridescent stone. The search continued for 2 days, the organized grid pattern slowly expanding outwards from the riverbank where Emily and Oliver were last seen. Each passing hour chipped away at David's resolve, the vastness of the park a constant, looming reminder of how easily someone could vanish within its embrace. Brody, despite his gruff exterior, proved to be a methodical and thorough leader. He coordinated the search teams, meticulously documenting their findings, however meager they were, but the lack of any substantial evidence began to weigh heavily on everyone. The mood at the ranger station, which served as their makeshift headquarters, grew increasingly somber. On the 3rd day, David and Sarah were assigned a sector that bordered a dense thicket of aspen trees. The trees, their leaves quivering in the gentle breeze, created an eerie, almost watchful atmosphere. David felt a prickle of unease as they entered the grove, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in fractured patterns that played tricks on the eye. They moved slowly, their boots sinking into the soft, loamy soil, their eyes scanning every inch of the ground. The silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird, a stark contrast to the cacophony of sounds that usually filled David's city life. Here, the silence felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken fears. Suddenly, Sarah stopped, her hand outstretched. "David, look." Half hidden beneath a cluster of ferns lay a small, brightly colored object. It was a child's backpack, its fabric torn and dirty, but the distinctive cartoon character emblazoned on its front was unmistakable. David's breath caught in his throat. "Oliver's?" He reached down, his hands trembling, and gently lifted the backpack. The fabric was ripped along one side, as if it had been snagged on something sharp. The zipper was open, and the contents spilled out onto the ground. A half-eaten granola bar, a small water bottle, and a crumpled piece of paper. David's heart pounded as he unfolded the paper. It was a map, crudely drawn in crayon, the landmarks barely recognizable. But in the corner, he recognized Oliver's distinctive scrawl, a lopsided drawing of a bison and the letters Ollie. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over David. Relief that they had found something, a tangible piece of his son's presence mixed with a fresh surge of fear. The backpack was damaged, the map torn. What had happened here? As he examined the map more closely, he noticed something else. A section of the map was missing, torn away along a jagged line. It was a crucial section, too, the area that depicted the trail leading deeper into the aspen grove. David's gaze snapped up, his eyes scanning the dense trees. The trail continued beyond where they found the backpack, disappearing into the shadows. A sense of foreboding settled over him, a cold premonition that the answers they sought lay hidden in the darkness of those trees, and that the path to those answers might be more dangerous than they could have imagined. The discovery of Oliver's backpack should have been a turning point, a surge of renewed energy in the search. Instead, it cast a pall of unease over the proceedings. David couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that the relief he should have felt was tainted by a growing sense of suspicion. It started subtly, a hesitation in Sheriff Brody's voice when he examined the backpack, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes when David pointed out the missing piece of the map. Then there were the Rangers. A few of them seemed overly eager to dismiss any findings, their eyes darting away when David asked questions. One in particular, a young man named Deputy Miller, seemed to avoid David altogether, his face flushed and his demeanor nervous whenever they were in close proximity. David, with his past law enforcement experience, was trained to notice these subtle cues, the unspoken language of body language and tone. And what they were telling him was that something was being hidden. He started to observe more closely, his senses heightened, his mind piecing together the fragments of information he had gathered. He noticed that Brody often held hushed conversations with a small group of rangers, their voices low and their expressions serious. He saw Deputy Miller slip away from the group one evening, disappearing into the darkness for almost an hour before returning, his clothes slightly disheveled. The official explanation for these occurrences was always something innocuous. A strategy meeting, a bathroom break, a patrol check. But David wasn't convinced. The unease within him grew, festering like an infected wound. One evening, as the search teams gathered around a campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, David decided to test the waters. "Sheriff," he began, his voice casual, "that missing piece of the map, it showed the trail heading deeper into the aspen grove, right?" Brody's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's right, but we've already searched that area. Nothing there." "Maybe not thoroughly enough," David pressed. "Oliver wouldn't have torn the map for no reason. Maybe he marked something on that missing piece." A tense silence descended over the group. Brody's gaze hardened. "We've done our due diligence, Mr. Kincaid. I understand you're anxious, but you need to trust my judgment." "With all due respect, Sheriff," David replied, his voice firm, "my wife and son are out there. I have a right to be involved." Deputy Miller shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between David and Brody. "The sheriff knows what he's doing, sir. We all do." His voice was high-pitched and nervous. David held Brody's gaze, his own unwavering. "Then you won't object to me taking another look?" "Just me." Brody hesitated for a long moment, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "All right, Mr. Kincaid, but you go with a ranger, and you stick to the trail. No heroics." David nodded, a small victory in his growing battle against suspicion. But as he looked around the campfire, at the faces of the rangers, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was alone in his search for the truth, and that the very people who were supposed to be helping him might be the ones standing in his way. True to his word, Sheriff Brody allowed David to revisit the aspen grove, assigning Deputy Miller to accompany him. But the young ranger's presence did little to ease David's growing unease. Miller remained withdrawn and nervous, his eyes constantly darting around as if expecting something to jump out from the trees. They followed the trail deeper into the grove, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. David tried to engage Miller in conversation, to glean any information that might shed light on his strange behavior, but the ranger offered only monosyllabic answers, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees grew taller and thicker, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sunlight, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The air was damp and still, heavy with the scent of decay. David felt a growing sense of being watched, an unsettling feeling that they were not alone in this silent, watchful place. He couldn't shake the image of the missing piece of Oliver's map, the jagged tear a silent accusation. As they pressed on, David's eyes scanned the trees, searching for anything out of the ordinary. He was looking for a sign, a clue, something that would lead him closer to Emily and Oliver. Then he saw it. On the trunk of a large aspen, partially obscured by a curtain of moss, were a series of markings. At first glance, they appeared to be random scratches, the work of some animal clawing at the bark. But as David approached, he realized they were something else entirely. They were symbols, meticulously carved into the wood, their lines precise and deliberate. They were unlike anything he had ever seen before, a strange and unfamiliar script. But something about them tugged at his memory, a faint echo of recognition. He traced the symbols with his fingers, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then it hit him. They resembled geological survey markers, the kind used to denote specific locations and elevations. And Emily used those markers in her work. A jolt of adrenaline shot through him, his heart pounding in his chest. Could it be? Could Emily have left these markings a trail for him to follow? He stepped back, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. There were more symbols, carved into other trunks, each one slightly different, but all bearing the same distinctive style. It was a code, a message hidden in plain sight. "Miller," David called out, his voice urgent. "Look at these." The ranger approached reluctantly, his eyes widening as he took in the carvings. "What are they?" he asked, his voice hushed. I think they're from Emily," David said, his voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. "She's a geologist. She used to use markers like these." Miller stared at the symbols, his face pale. "But what do they mean?" "I don't know yet," David replied, his mind racing, "but I'm going to find out." He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he tried to take a picture of the symbols. No signal. Of course, they were too deep in the grove. He grabbed a small notebook from his backpack and began to sketch the symbols, meticulously copying each line and curve. He had to record them, to preserve this fragile thread of hope. As he worked, a sense of purpose filled him, pushing back the despair that had threatened to consume him. He was no longer just searching. He was following a trail, a path laid out by his wife, a woman whose intelligence and resourcefulness he had always admired. But even as hope flickered within him, a nagging question remained. Why would Emily leave a coded message? What danger was she trying to warn him about? And what secrets lay hidden at the end of this trail of symbols? Deputy Miller's unease grew with each new symbol David discovered. He became increasingly agitated, his earlier nervousness escalating into a palpable fear. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his hand hovering near his sidearm. "We should turn back," he said, his voice trembling. "This place, it's not right." David ignored him, his focus entirely on the trail of symbols. They led deeper and deeper into the aspen grove, the trees growing taller and more imposing, their shadows stretching like long skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. As they rounded a bend in the trail, they came upon a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls weathered and gray, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and fallen leaves. Smoke curled from a crooked chimney, a thin plume against the darkening sky. Miller froze, his eyes wide with terror. "We shouldn't be here," he whispered. This is his place." "His place?" David asked, his curiosity piqued. "Whose place?" Before Miller could answer, the cabin door creaked open, and an old man stepped out. He was tall and gaunt, his face a web of wrinkles, his eyes piercing and intense. He wore clothes made of rough-spun cloth, patched and faded, and his long white hair fell to his shoulders. He carried a gnarled wooden staff, its surface worn smooth with age. He looked at them, his gaze sweeping over them like a cold wind. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice raspy like the rustling of dry leaves. "This is forbidden ground." Miller recoiled, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. "We're with the sheriff's department," he stammered. "We're just searching." The old man's eyes narrowed. "The sheriff has no authority here. This land belongs to the old ways, to the spirits of the forest." David stepped forward, his curiosity outweighing his apprehension. "We're looking for my wife and son," he said, his voice steady. "They disappeared in the park a few days ago. We found these symbols carved into the trees. Do you know what they mean?" He showed the old man his notebook, pointing to the sketches of the symbols. The old man's eyes flickered over the drawings, his expression unreadable. "Those are markings of the ancients," he said finally, his voice hushed. "They guide those who dare to walk the dark trails." "Dark trails?" David asked, his interest piqued. "What are dark trails?" The old man's gaze turned distant as if he were looking into the past. "Trails that lead to places best left undisturbed," he said. "Places where the veil between worlds is thin, where the spirits of the forest hold sway." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There are legends, you know. Tales of people who followed those trails and never returned. Swallowed by the darkness, claimed by the forest." Miller shuffled his feet nervously. "We should go, sir. We shouldn't be listening to this." David ignored him, his eyes fixed on the old man. "My wife wouldn't have gone willingly," he said. "She wouldn't have put our son in danger." The old man shrugged. "The forest has its own ways of drawing people in. Sometimes it's not a matter of choice. He pointed his staff towards the depths of the grove. The trail of symbols leads to the heart of the darkness, to a place where the answers you seek may be found. But be warned, the price for those answers may be higher than you're willing to pay. He turned and walked back into his cabin, the door creaking shut behind him. The smoke from the chimney swirled and thickened, obscuring the cabin from view, as if it were fading into the trees. David stood there for a long moment, the old man's words echoing in his mind. Dark trails, legends of disappearance, a price to pay. A shiver ran down his spine, a primal fear that whispered of unseen dangers. But the thought of Emily and Oliver, lost and alone, pushed back the fear. He had come too far to turn back now. He turned to Miller, his eyes determined. "We're going to follow that trail," he said. "Are you coming with me, or are you going back to the sheriff?" Miller looked at the cabin, now completely obscured by the smoke, his face pale and drawn. He hesitated for a long moment, then shook his head. I can't," he stammered. "I'll wait for you here." David nodded, understanding the ranger's fear but also feeling a surge of frustration. He was alone again, facing the unknown with only the cryptic warnings of an old hermit to guide him. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the trail, his gaze fixed on the darkening depths of the aspen grove, ready to face whatever secrets lay hidden within. David stood at the edge of the clearing, the hermit's words hanging in the air like a lingering mist. The trail of symbols beckoned him forward, a silent invitation into the unknown. He glanced back at Deputy Miller, who remained rooted to the spot, his face pale and drawn. "I'm going," David said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "You can wait here, or you can go back, but I'm following this trail." He turned and stepped onto the path, the trees closing in around him, swallowing him in their shadows. The air grew colder, the silence deeper. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching his every move. As he walked, David's mind raced, trying to decipher the meaning of the symbols. He had recognized their resemblance to geological survey markers, but there was something more to them, something hidden beneath the surface. He pulled out his notebook, flipping through the pages filled with his meticulous sketches. He studied the symbols, comparing their shapes and patterns, searching for a connection. Then it struck him. It wasn't just the style of the markings that reminded him of Emily's work. It was their arrangement. They weren't scattered randomly on the trees. They followed a specific sequence, each symbol slightly different from the last. His heart began to pound as a realization dawned on him. What if these weren't just markers? What if they were something else entirely? He grabbed his compass from his backpack, his hands trembling slightly. He held it up, aligning the needle with the north. Then he looked at his sketches again. Each symbol, he noticed, seemed to correspond to a specific direction and distance. A particular curve might indicate a bearing, while the length of a line could represent a measurement. His mind, trained in logic and observation, began to piece it together. It was a code, a sophisticated system of navigation hidden in plain sight. And then it hit him, the full weight of the truth crashing down upon him like a tidal wave. These weren't just geological markers, they were coordinates. Emily, in her brilliance and resourcefulness, had left him a map, a trail of breadcrumbs hidden within the language of her profession. She had known that if anyone could decipher it, it would be him. A surge of adrenaline coursed through him, pushing back the fear and uncertainty. He wasn't lost in the darkness. He was following a guide, a message from his wife leading him to her and Oliver. He started to work feverishly, using his compass and his knowledge of map reading to translate the symbols into bearings and distances. He scribbled numbers and calculations in his notebook, his mind focused and determined. The trail led him deeper into the forest, the trees growing taller and more imposing, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that blotted out the sky. But David didn't falter. He had a purpose now, a direction. He was no longer just searching. He was on a mission, driven by love and a desperate hope. And he would follow Emily's coded coordinates to the ends of the earth if he had to bring his family home. David stood at a crossroads both literally and figuratively. The coded coordinates, meticulously deciphered from Emily's symbols, pointed in a direction that defied both Sheriff Brody's orders and the old hermit's warnings. Sheriff Brody had been adamant. Stay on the designated search paths. Avoid venturing deeper into the wilderness. The old hermit's words echoed with an unsettling resonance. Dark trails. Places best left undisturbed, a price to pay. But David couldn't ignore the pull of the coordinates, the silent beacon calling him towards a destination only Emily could have charted. It was the only tangible lead he had, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty and despair. He looked back at Deputy Miller, who still lingered at the edge of the aspen grove, his face a mask of fear and reluctance. "I'm going," David said, his voice resolute. "I don't expect you to come with me, but I can't turn back now." Miller shook his head, his eyes wide. "It's too dangerous, sir. The sheriff will have my badge if I let you go alone." "Then go back and tell him I left," David replied, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "Tell him I'm following the only lead I have left." He knew he was defying authority, risking his own safety, but the thought of Emily and Oliver, lost and vulnerable, fueled his determination. He turned and stepped onto the trail indicated by the coordinates, his heart pounding with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation. The path was narrow and overgrown, barely visible beneath a tangle of vines and roots. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the remaining sunlight. The air grew heavy and still, the silence broken only by the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. David pressed on, his senses heightened, every nerve on edge. He knew he was entering a different world, a place where the rules of the civilized world didn't apply. The trail twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the heart of the wilderness. He consulted his compass and the coordinates frequently, ensuring he stayed on course. The landscape began to change. The aspen trees gave way to towering pines, their needles carpeting the forest floor in a thick, springy layer. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. He crossed rushing streams on fallen logs, climbed over moss-covered rocks, and pushed his way through dense thickets of thorny bushes. The terrain was treacherous, testing his endurance and his resolve. As the day wore on, the light began to fade, casting long, eerie shadows that danced and twisted in the gloom. The forest seemed to come alive, its sounds amplified in the stillness. David knew he should find shelter for the night, but the coordinates urged him onward, promising answers, offering a glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness. He pressed on, driven by a force stronger than fear, a love that transcended reason and defied the warnings of men and legends. He was on a dangerous path, a path into the unknown, but it was the only path that could lead him back to his family. Darkness had fallen, enveloping the forest in an impenetrable blackness. David pressed on, guided by the faint glow of his flashlight and the unwavering pull of the coordinates. The terrain became increasingly difficult, forcing him to scramble over rocks and wade through icy streams. He was exhausted, his muscles screaming in protest, his body begging for rest. But the image of Emily and Oliver, their faces etched in his memory, spurred him forward. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close. According to his calculations, the coordinates pointed to a location deep within the park, an area marked on his map as a restricted zone. The old hermit's warnings echoed in his mind. Forbidden ground. The spirits of the forest hold sway. A sense of foreboding settled over him, a primal fear that whispered of unseen dangers. But he pressed on, driven by a force stronger than fear, a father's love, a husband's devotion. As he navigated a particularly dense thicket of trees, his flashlight beam caught something unexpected, a break in the undergrowth, a subtle parting of the tangled vines and branches. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding, his senses on high alert. Pushing aside the foliage, he discovered a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person to pass through. It was a hidden path, concealed by the dense vegetation, as if deliberately obscured from view. A shiver ran down his spine. This wasn't a game trail or an animal track. This was something else. Something intentional. He hesitated for a moment, his mind wrestling with doubt. Was this a trap? Was he being led into danger? But the coordinates aligned perfectly with this hidden path. It was the only way forward. Taking a deep breath, he squeezed through the opening, the vines and branches scraping against his clothes. The path descended steeply, winding its way down a rocky slope. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. The trees here were ancient and gnarled, their branches reaching up like skeletal fingers, their shadows twisting into grotesque shapes. He felt a sense of being watched, an unsettling feeling that he had crossed a threshold, entering a place where he didn't belong. The forest seemed to hold its breath, its secrets guarded by the silent sentinels of the trees. As he continued down the slope, the path leveled out, leading him into a narrow valley. The darkness here was absolute, the only light coming from his flashlight beam, cutting a meager swathe through the gloom. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A faint glow, emanating from the depths of the valley. A soft, ethereal light that pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm. His heart pounded in his chest. What was it? A campfire? A dwelling? Or something else? Something stranger? He quickened his pace, drawn towards the light, his fear overshadowed by a desperate hope. He was getting closer. He could feel it. He was on the right path, the hidden path, leading him towards the truth, whatever it might be. The faint glow in the distance grew stronger as David descended further into the valley. It pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the darkness. The air grew heavy, thick with a sense of anticipation, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He reached the valley floor, the terrain leveling out into a rocky clearing. The source of the light became clear, a gaping hole in the side of a cliff face, an opening that seemed to swallow the darkness, its edges glowing with an eerie luminescence. It was a mine entrance, old and abandoned, its timbers rotting and decaying. A rusted cart track led into the darkness, disappearing into the depths of the earth. David approached cautiously, his flashlight beam dancing across the entrance. The air emanating from the mine was cold and stale, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and acrid. He hesitated at the threshold, a sense of unease washing over him. This place felt wrong, tainted by a darkness that went beyond the absence of light. But the coordinates had led him here, and he couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the mine, his flashlight beam cutting a meager swathe through the oppressive darkness. The entrance tunnel was low and narrow, forcing him to crouch as he moved forward. The air grew colder and damper with each step, the silence broken only by the dripping of water and the echo of his own footsteps. The walls of the tunnel were rough and uneven, the rock cold and slick to the touch. As he ventured deeper, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. His flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing a scene of desolation and decay. Old mining equipment lay scattered about, rusted and broken. Wooden support beams sagged and crumbled, threatening to collapse. The air was thick with dust, making it difficult to breathe. But then, he saw something that made his heart leap with a mixture of hope and terror. A faint light flickered in the distance, emanating from a side tunnel. He moved towards it, his footsteps quickening, his breath catching in his throat. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller and more enclosed. And there, on the wall, he saw them. Scrawled in charcoal, barely visible in the dim light, were markings. Familiar markings. Geological survey symbols, the same ones Emily had used, the same ones he had deciphered from the trees. His hand trembled as he reached out to touch them. They were faint and smudged, but unmistakable. And beneath them, a message written in Emily's handwriting. Ollie's stone leads to the dark. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a sickening lurch in his stomach. Ollie's stone, the iridescent stone. It was connected to this place, to this mine. He scanned the chamber frantically, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls. And then he saw another clue. A small, torn piece of fabric caught on a jagged rock. It was a bright, familiar color, the color of Oliver's jacket. His legs went weak, his heart pounding in his chest. They had been here. Emily and Oliver had been in this dark, desolate place. But where were they now? And what was the meaning of Emily's cryptic message? The answers, he knew, lay deeper within the mine, in the heart of the darkness. And he would follow them, no matter the cost. Driven by a desperate hope, David ventured deeper into the mine, following the faint trail of Emily's markings. The tunnels twisted and turned, a labyrinth of darkness and decay. The air grew thick and stale, making it hard to breathe. He felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that he was being watched. The silence of the mine was oppressive, broken only by the echo of his own footsteps and the occasional drip of water. He pressed on, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls, searching for any sign of Emily or Oliver. The tunnels seemed to stretch on endlessly, leading him further and further into the earth's embrace. Then he reached a large cavern. The beam of his flashlight revealed a vast space, its walls shimmering with an unnatural glow. Strange, crystalline formations jutted out from the rock, their surfaces reflecting the light in a dazzling array of colors. It was a sight of breathtaking beauty, a hidden wonder buried deep within the earth. But there was something unsettling about it, an unnatural stillness, an eerie silence. As David stepped into the cavern, a voice echoed from the shadows. "Well, well, what do we have here?" David whirled around, his flashlight beam sweeping across the darkness. Figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by the dim light. They were armed, their weapons glinting menacingly. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said, closer now. It was rough and gravelly, laced with a hint of menace. "I'm looking for my wife and son," David said, his voice steady, masking the fear that gripped him. They were here. The figures chuckled, a chilling sound that echoed through the cavern. "You're a long way from home," one of them said. "This place is ours." David realized then. These weren't just trespassers, they were organized, guarding something. The strange crystals in the cavern walls. "What are you mining here?" David asked, his mind racing. The leader of the group stepped forward, his face finally visible in the flashlight beam. He was a tall, imposing man, his eyes cold and hard. "That's none of your concern," he said. "But you've seen too much. You can't leave here." Before David could react, they moved. He was outnumbered, outgunned. They overpowered him quickly, their movements swift and efficient. He struggled, but it was futile. They bound his hands and feet, the ropes biting into his skin. They gagged him, silencing his protests. They dragged him deeper into the mine, his body bumping along the rough ground. The crystalline glow of the cavern faded behind him, replaced by the oppressive darkness of the tunnels. He was their prisoner now, trapped in the depths of the earth, at the mercy of these unknown men. His mind raced with questions. Who were they? What were they mining? And what had happened to Emily and Oliver? He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was caught in something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Confined in the dimly lit cell, David struggled to reconcile the pieces of the puzzle. He was a prisoner, the victim of a calculated deception. The reality of his situation began to solidify, chilling him to the bone. Those weren't real police, or maybe they were. Gyro's words echoed in his mind. Many police here work for others. The realization hit David with the force of a physical blow. The officers he had trusted, the very people who were supposed to be helping him, had betrayed him. They hadn't been leading a search party. They had delivered him to this hidden operation. "Wait," David said, studying Gyro more closely. "Are you Ricky Gyro?" The man nodded slowly. "I am. And you are Julia's husband." David moved closer, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. "Do you know where they are? Are they alive?" Gyro offered a flicker of hope. "I have heard their voices here. But it has been some days since I last heard them. They move people around." Relief and fear warred within David. His family was alive, but they were prisoners. He had to know the truth. "What happened that day on the river?" David asked. How did you all end up here?" Before Gyro could answer, the sound of a heavy door opening from above interrupted them. As Gyro was taken away, David strained to listen to the voices from above. He pieced together fragments of conversation, enough to understand the grim reality. This wasn't just a simple kidnapping. It was something far more intricate and dangerous. The truth began to unravel, revealing a web of deceit and corruption. Emily and Oliver hadn't simply gotten lost. They had stumbled upon something they weren't meant to see. David recalled Emily's profession, a geologist, and then the strange crystals in the cavern. The pieces clicked into place. The illegal operation wasn't drug-related, as David initially assumed. It was about the rare minerals hidden within the mine, minerals Emily would have immediately recognized. Emily, with her scientific curiosity, must have noticed something during the boat tour. Perhaps she saw signs of the mining operation, or maybe Oliver's discovery of the unusual stone had triggered her suspicions. She had done what any good scientist would do: investigate. And that investigation had made them a threat. The corrupt officers, likely involved in facilitating the mining operation, had used the search as a cover to silence them. They had kidnapped Emily and Oliver to protect their illicit activities. Sheriff Brody's face flashed in David's memory. His evasiveness, his attempts to steer David away from the truth, his control over the search. It all made sense now. He was involved. David's heart pounded with a cold fury. The people he had trusted to help him had betrayed him in the worst possible way, but he wouldn't let them win. He would find his family and expose their treachery. Confined within the mine, David wrestled with his options. He was a prisoner, but he refused to be a victim. His past as a park ranger had instilled in him a resilience, a knowledge of survival and tracking that he knew he could draw upon. He began to observe his surroundings with a keen eye, cataloging every detail. The layout of the tunnels, the routines of his captors, the points of weakness in his confinement. He had to find a way out, and he had to do it quickly. His thoughts turned to the old hermit. The man had warned him of the dangers, but he had also spoken of old ways and spirits of the forest. David wondered if those words held a deeper meaning, if the hermit might be a source of help. Under the cover of darkness, when the mine fell into a tense stillness, David slipped away from his captors. He navigated the labyrinthine tunnels, his movements silent and precise, using his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. He emerged from the mine entrance, blinking against the starlight. The forest loomed before him, dark and imposing, but David felt a surge of determination. He was back in his element. He made his way back through the aspen grove, his ranger instincts guiding him. He moved with caution, avoiding detection, his senses alert to any sign of danger. He reached the hermit's cabin, a beacon of solitude in the wilderness. The old man emerged, his eyes piercing in the darkness. David explained his situation, the illegal mining operation, the capture of Emily and Oliver, the sheriff's betrayal. He appealed to the hermit for help, not with pleas, but with a shared understanding of the forest and its secrets. The hermit listened intently, his expression grave. He spoke of hidden pathways, of forgotten trails known only to a few, trails that could lead them to the heart of the mine undetected. Together, they planned their course of action. David's knowledge of tactical maneuvers, combined with the hermit's intimate understanding of the terrain, formed a formidable alliance. They moved under the cover of night, two figures blending seamlessly into the shadows of the forest. The hermit led the way, his movements agile and swift despite his age, guiding David through a network of secret trails. They reached the mine, approaching from an unexpected direction, a hidden entrance known only to the hermit. David used his ranger skills to disable the mine's security, his movements precise and efficient. Inside, they moved through the tunnels like ghosts, avoiding the guards, their footsteps silent on the damp earth. David's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. He was so close. They found Emily and Oliver in a makeshift cell, hidden deep within the mine. The reunion was charged with emotion, relief washing over them in a powerful wave. But there was no time for tears. They had to get out. David, using his knowledge of rescue techniques, led his family and the hermit through the hidden passages back towards freedom. Their escape was fraught with peril, but David's skills and the hermit's guidance allowed them to evade their captors. They emerged from the mine, blinking in the pre-dawn light, the ordeal finally over. They had reclaimed their family, their lives, from the darkness of the mine. But David knew their fight was far from over. The truth about the illegal operation and the sheriff's involvement had to be exposed. Emerging from the mine was not the end, but a new beginning. David, Emily, and Oliver, guided by the hermit, returned to the world, forever changed by their ordeal. The fresh air filled their lungs, a stark contrast to the stale, oppressive atmosphere of the tunnels. But the memory of what they had endured lingered, a shadow clinging to their relief. David knew that they couldn't simply walk away. The illegal mining operation continued to operate, fueled by greed and protected by corruption. Sheriff Brody and his accomplices had to be brought to justice. The hermit, despite his reclusive nature, agreed to help. He possessed a deep understanding of the local community, knowledge of hidden pathways, and trusted individuals. He became their ally, a silent force working in the shadows. Their return was carefully orchestrated. David, using his ranger skills, navigated them back to civilization, avoiding contact with those who might seek to silence them. They reached out to those they could trust, individuals who valued justice and were willing to stand against corruption. Emily's knowledge of geology proved invaluable. She meticulously documented her findings from the mine, the unique mineral deposits, the scale of the operation. This evidence, combined with David's testimony and the hermit's insights, painted a damning picture. The revelation of the truth sent shockwaves through the community. The illegal mining, the sheriff's involvement, the kidnapping. It was a betrayal of trust that shattered the foundations of their society. David, Emily, and the hermit, working with their newfound allies, presented their evidence to the authorities, bypassing the compromised channels. The weight of their combined testimony was undeniable. The authorities were forced to act. An investigation was launched, uncovering the full extent of the criminal operation and the corruption that protected it. Sheriff Brody and his accomplices were exposed, their web of deceit unraveling before their eyes. The mine was shut down, the illegal activities brought to an end. Justice was served, though the scars of the ordeal remained. David and his family had faced the darkness and emerged. Their bonds strengthened, their resolve hardened. They had exposed the truth, not through violence, but through resilience, knowledge, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The experience changed them, deepening their appreciation for the fragile balance of nature and the importance of integrity. They had witnessed the depths of human greed and the power of human resilience. And they had chosen to stand for the light,